Welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. I'm Amy Shannon, but you can call me Amy. Thank you for listening. I'm Amy, and today I'm talking about the author Helen Keller. Now, you may or may not know who Helen Keller actually is. Um, um, she was an author um, and an advocate for disability rights. Um, she became well known probably during her life, but after her death, and there were some movies that were created based on um, the beginning years of her life. Um, there are movies, and they're all had the same name, The Miracle Worker. Um, there was a version of that in 1962 where Patty Duke and Anne Bancroft starred in that movie. Patty Duke played a young Helen Keller. Years later, in 1972, um, Patty Duke, now all grown up, played Anne Sullivan, who was Helen Keller's teacher, and a very young Melissa Gilbert played Helen. Um, Later on, there was a movie in the year 2000. It was also called The Miracle Worker. Um, uh, Actress Allison Elliott played Anne, and young Hallie Eisenberg played Helen. Um, Actually, the first two movies that I mentioned, I actually saw those versions. This 2000 movie that is new to me, so it's something that I will seek out and watch because I find it interesting how people can tell the same story, and when it's portrayed, um, it's different. Some remakes are basically, they're the same story, but the way it's played shows it's different. But then there's some that are it just seems the same. It's just the um, interpretation of a person's life. Helen Keller, um, she was born without complications. Um, she could talk and make some sounds that she could see. She could hear. And then when she was 19 months old, she got some illness, and they really never diagnosed that what it actually was. There are some people that speculate on what had happened to her, um, but then it left her deaf and blind. And I must say that I think it's important to know that in our history, people that were deaf or mute were perceived as also being dumb, deaf, dumb, and blind. That's something they used to say. If they were just because someone couldn't speak or they couldn't hear, they thought that they couldn't learn. And um, and sometimes because a person was treated that way, they reacted in a way that kind of what it seemed like, that they were giving credit to what was deemed very incorrect. Um, but sometimes it just takes patience and a person to change that perception of someone. Um, Helen Keller, she wrote a book called The Story of My Life. She was known for writing essays and speeches, and it was something very interesting. Her story about the one she wrote, The Story of My Life, is something that I had just finished reading. Um, and it takes place after a famous, in the movie, there was this scene when um, Helen finally realized what words were in association with the actual object. And one of the things that it took was like the first thing that she realized that's when she could spell out water, water, with her fingers, that she was able to finally associate that with actual water. There's a scene at the end of the movie where she kind of speaks for the first time since she had been a baby, and she, proved to her family, her teacher Ann Sullivan, that she could learn. Anne always knew she could, but it was, um, Helen didn't know what to do with herself. She acted out. She had what people thought were tantrums. And her parents didn't give her any restrictions. They let her do what she wants. And then when Anne came around, Anne taught her. First, she taught her, how to spell with her fingers. And that was, if you think about now, if someone can speak or can see and you know, they are um, hearing impaired or deaf and they use sign language, there's a lot of shortcuts with the sign language and signs for various things. But if you can't see that, you you need to be able to feel it. So her teacher would teach her how to, and she taught her mother as well, how to speak with her hands and spell out words. And so, you know, Helen would have to have someone put the words in, spell them out in her hand so she could feel what the word was. And then Helen would do the same thing and then try to figure out if she was right or wrong. So, one of the things that was just something that Helen would do, her mother would do, is if she found if she was right, she could put her hand on her mother's face and her mother would shake her head, or she would nod, whether she was right or the answer was yes or no. Um, there's a point where Helen has this doll, and nobody thought to give the doll eyes because they figured Helen couldn't see or for whatever reason. But Helen was able to determine that this doll didn't have eyes, and that was the problem. That's why she didn't like this doll. So they sewed buttons for eyes on this doll. Um, she went through a lot, and she could have lived in a different way. Not everyone agreed with her ways, but she was an inspiration to deaf and blind students. Not everybody who is deaf is blind, and not everybody who is blind is deaf. But there are people like that, such as Helen Keller, and um, her teacher, Anne Sullivan, became more of a companion and also a teacher. And they, even after she was done being her teacher, they were friends and they did things together. They supported each other. Um, Helen lived with Anne until she died. Um, and well, she lived with Anne and her husband until Anne had died. And actually, Helen was there holding Anne's hand when she passed away. Anne always had problems with her eyes. She was blind as a child. She had a lot of different surgeries, and she wore sunglasses because her eyes were always bothering her. Um, in it's just a interesting story. Um, if you haven't read anything from Helen Keller, um, it's something you might have learned in school. I remember being in I think it was grade school reading her book, um, and learning about her. And my mother loved both movies, The Miracle Worker. Um, one time I remember, um, I live in upstate New York, so there is a city south of where I live, and it has what is called Proctor's Theater, where they will actually have Broadway shows, participate there. But sometimes they would do film festivals, and my mother and would she took me to when they were playing The Miracle Worker, and she loved it so much. So after my mom was the kind of person that would wait till everybody left and she would still be sitting there watching the credits. And I remember the usher came in and he was doing some cleanup before the next show. And he's like, my mom looked at him and said, "Oh, we'd like to watch this again. Can we, you know, go buy another ticket or whatever?" And he's like, "Stay as long as you want." He sat through like four sittings of that movie just because she loved it so much. And she liked to read, and I just remember that, you know, um, he didn't care. He's like, yeah, 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 just sit and watch how many you want. I mean, nowadays there's binge watching, but there wasn't this, sitting in a movie theater well, even it's an off-Broadway type of theater. They put on plays and live shows and they do film festivals and things like that. Um, and this is back in yeah, I'd say the 80s. Yeah, I was young and it was just something that, that resonates a memory with me and my mom. I mean, it's wasn't very often that we could be away from home for like 8 hours. My mother was she was the mother of five children, me being the oldest, and um and usually I was the babysitter. So I guess my dad had to really pay attention to the kids that he had to watch. Um, as I had mentioned earlier, that I had read the Helen Keller's The Story of My Life, and there was something that there's a chapter that I wanted to share because I found it very interesting. So, Helen Keller's The Story of My Life, and I'm going to read chapter 6. I had now the key to all language, and I was eager to learn to use it. Children who acquire language without any particular effort, the words that fall from others' lips, they catch on the wing as if it were delighted, while the little deaf child must trap them by a slow and often painful process. But whatever the process, the result is wonderful. Gradually, from naming an object, we advance step by step until we have traversed the vast distance between our first stammered syllable and the sweep of thought in a line of Shakespeare. At first, when my teacher told me about a new thing, I asked very few questions. My ideas were vague and my vocabulary was inadequate. But as my knowledge of things grew and I learned more and more words, my field of inquiry broadened, and I would return again and again to the same subject, eager for further information. Sometimes a new word revived an image that some earlier experience had engraved on my brain. I remember the morning that I first asked the meaning of the word love. This was before I knew many words. I had found a few early violets in the garden and brought them to my teacher. She tried to kiss me, but at the time I didn't like to have anyone kiss me except my mother. Miss Sullivan put her arm gently around me and spelled into my hand, "I love Helen." "What is love?" I asked. She drew me close to her and said, "It is here," pointing to my heart, whose beats I was conscious of for the very first time. Her words puzzled me very much because I didn't understand anything unless I touched it. I smelt the violets in her hand and asked, half in words, half in signs, a question which meant, "Is love the sweetness of flowers?" No, said my teacher. Again, I thought, the warm sun was shining on this. Is this not love? I asked, pointing in the direction from which the heat came. Is this not love? It seemed to me that there was nothing more beautiful than the sun, whose warmth makes all things grow. But Miss Sullivan shook her head, and I was greatly puzzled and disappointed. I thought it was strange that my teacher could not show me love. A day or two afterwards, I was stringing beads of a different size in symmetrical groups, two large beads, three small ones, and so on. I had made many mistakes, and Miss Sullivan had pointed them out again and again with gentle patience. Finally, I noticed a very obvious error in the sequence, and for an instant, I concentrated my attention on the lesson and tried to think how I should have arranged the beads. Miss Sullivan touched my forehead and spelled with decided emphasis, "Think." In a flash, I knew that the word was the name of the process that was going on in my head. That was my first conscious perception of an abstract idea. For a long time, I was still. I was not thinking of the beads in my lap, but trying to find a meaning for love in the light of this new idea. The sun had been under a cloud all day, and there had been brief showers, but suddenly the sun broke forth in all its southern splendor. Again, I asked my teacher, "Is this not love?" "Love is something like the clouds that were in the sky before the sun came out," she replied. Then, in simpler words than these, which at the time I could not have understood, she explained, "You cannot touch the clouds, you know, but you feel the rain and know how glad the flowers and the thirsty earth are to have it after a long, hot day. You cannot touch love either, but you can feel the sweetness that it pours into everything. Without love, you would not be able to be happy or want to play." The beautiful truth burst upon my mind. I felt there were other invisible lines stretched between my spirit and the spirit of others. From the beginning of my education, Miss Sullivan made it a practice to speak to me as she would speak to any hearing child. The only difference was that she spelled the sentences in my hand instead of speaking them. If I did not know the words and idioms necessary to express my thoughts, she supplied them, even suggesting conversation when I was unable to keep up my end of the dialogue. This process was continued for several years. The deaf, the deaf child does not learn in a month or even 2 or 3 years the numberless idioms and expressions used in the simplest daily intercourse. The little hearing child learns these from constant repetition and imitation. The conversation he hears in his home stimulates his mind, suggests topics, and calls forth the spontaneous expression of his own thoughts. This natural exchange of ideas is denied to the deaf child. My teacher, realizing this, determined to supply the kinds of stimulus I lacked. This she did by repeating to me as far as possible verbatim what she had heard, and by showing me how I could take part in the conversation. But it was a long time before I ventured to take the initiative, and still longer before I could find something appropriate to say at the right time. The deaf and the blind find it very difficult to acquire the amenities of conversation. How much more this difficulty must be augmented in the case of those who are both deaf and blind. They cannot distinguish the tone of the voice, or without assistance go up and down the gamut of tones that give significance to words, nor can they watch the expression of the speaker's face and a look that is the very soul of what one says. So this episode has been dedicated to the life and the work of Helen Keller. And, if you're interested, her stories are available on Amazon, and they are quite interesting, educational, and it also gives you another look at perspective of language and how um, what she learned over years and years, and probably throughout her entire life. Being a lifelong learner to her was more than just kind of learning more stuff. It was about tone and um, conversations and things that hearing and speaking um, and seeing people um, not take for granted, but don't think about. We just learn and talk and share ideas. And that's what Helen Keller was trying to grasp. Sometimes you just feel things, and she wanted to know what it was that was felt and what it was called and what it actually was. This has been Amy Shannon from Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. And if you're an author who wants to be on the show, or you just want your book to be on the show, go to amysbookshelfreviews.com/podcast for more information. This has been Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. Thank you for listening. And always, be kind and stay safe. Thank you. If you're an author and you want your book reviewed, go to amysbookshelfreviews.com for more information. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next week.